Welcome to episode 6 of Shape Explorations. So this week I did something a little bit different and I decided to explore the use of colour within shape. So usually the way that I approach colour in my work is that I use thread colours to create different patterns and sections of colour within the shapes that I'm creating. So this week what I did is I took some offcuts of rope that I had in, I've got a huge bags of these offcuts, and I decided to dip dye them in paint baths. So the paint that I used was a specific textile paint designed for screen printing, and I watered them down by about 50% because they're chalk based paint, which means that if you're painting directly onto the rope, it's fabulous, but if you're trying to coat the rope as a whole material, it's too thick. So I thought I'd water it down. So I did that by about 50%. So there was 50% paint, 50% water, and then essentially just soaked the rope in the paint. So I filled up the bucket as much as I could with as much rope as I could cram in. And then what I had to do was go through each section of rope and drag it through my hands, which were covered in paint, to make sure that all the bits of braid in the rope actually got covered with the paint. After I'd completed that process, I needed to let the paint set and dry. This paint that I've used is a heat setting paint, so in order for that to work it needs to be steamed or ironed to make sure that the paint is actually set. So the decision that I made was that I would dry the rope initially and then stitch with it and then set the paint afterwards. So I will get the balls now and show you what I made with this rope. So these are the two pieces that I made this week with the orange rope that I made. So I'll just talk you through each bowl. So the first one, what I did is I took the orange rope and I stitched it to my normal unbleached rope. So it's the same rope, but one has got the orange paint and the other is just undyed, it's just plain. And I used a coral thread to stitch the two ropes together. So I had to put that through the machine first, and then essentially I had a double thickness rope to create some shapes with. So because I was using offcuts, I haven't had huge sections of rope to work with in this particular project, so I just decided to make some small shapes. So I decided to go for a very classic rope bowl shape, and just to create something with a little bit of an accented loop finish there, and to highlight the difference to myself between the bit that was already stitched and the new stitching. I used two different colours. So I originally stitched the ropes together with this coral thread, and then I did the second overlapping stitch with this blue thread so that I could see on the machine for myself where the stitching was. But I really like how it turned out. I think it came out kind of beachy looking. So a couple of the issues that I ran across with this were that because I didn't set the paint, I didn't heat set it before I stitched with it, there's quite a bit of smudging onto the plain rope, which you can sort of see if I hold it up. You can sort of see in the middle that where, especially in the beginning when I was sort of, having to do the fiddly bit of getting the spiral started. So it doesn't smudge all the way through, but then again at the top where I've worked it quite hard to get it backwards and forwards through the machine, you can see that the paint has smudged. And because it's textile paint, I can't really get that paint out, so that's just something that I'll have to live with. But once I'd made the shape, I then used a handheld steamer and I gave it a really good steam over. So this is now set, so the paint's not going to come off this now, but I could probably do with 2 or 3 steams to make sure that all of the paint is completely set, because there's so much of it in between the stitching sections. So I think if I attempted that bit again, I would probably heat set the paint before I stitched with it. So I'll just get the other bowl to show you as well. So this was the other bowl that I made, and you can see that it's a much bigger one than the smaller one, and this was a much larger section of rope that I'd managed to dye. So and I chose different colours for this one, so it was exactly the same. I'd stitched the orange thread, the orange rope and the unbleached rope together with the coral thread, and then when I stitched the shape I used this kind of grapey pink colour. I had exactly the same issue on this one that I had on the first one, which was that on the areas where I had to do lots of work backwards and forwards through the machine, there was smudging of the paint that wasn't set yet. So at this point, when I was stitching it, it was completely dry, but the paint wasn't set. So that is something that I would definitely learn if I did this technique again, to make sure that I steam all of the rope and let it dry again before I work with it. I think I was a little bit excited to see how it was going to come out, and I maybe didn't think through that process completely. But you can see at the top where I did this sort of knotted finish, that same thing, because I was pulling the rope with my hands, I've smudged the paint there. But I think despite that, I think they've come out looking really cute. So yeah, you can see this was a totally different effect that it's created from my previous work. So this is a stripy effect, and the interesting thing about this is that you have to think a little bit more carefully about the finish. So because it's a double thickness, you've kind of got this double end to work with when you finish. So I sort of just did a knotted finish on there, but I think working with a double rope would need a bit of consideration to how to finish it neatly. So that's a whole other world that I need to explore, of how I could do some different finishes on those. So yeah, it was a really fun project to do, but there were a lot of processes involved, and I think if you are wanting to use up some textile paint and you've got some offcuts of rope and you sort of want to try and throw the two together, this was a really good way to do it. So I'll show you the two bowls alongside each other. So they do look very different, because I've gone for a kind of almost a honeypot style shape with this one, and this was just kind of a classic outwards almost trinket bowl, and I did two very different finishes. And I think that this one kind of has a warmer look because I used the sort of two pink toned threads, but with this one, because I used blue, actually on camera it's coming out a little bit more green, so that was interesting because I hadn't anticipated that. So I think that that was a really fun experiment. I did also dye some rope in a red colour, but I haven't had a chance to stitch that up yet. But I think the lesson that I've learned from this one is that I need to heat set that rope before I work with it. The other thing that I noticed was through my sewing machine, when I was stitching with the orange rope, it was leaving like a residue on my needle plate, and underneath in my bobbin cage there was quite a lot of flecks of the orange paint that had come through. And I don't know, when I stitch with the red one, I need to see if it has the same effect, because that would definitely put me off stitching lots and lots of meters of it, because I feel like it would clog up the machine quite quickly. But I think for small projects it was absolutely fun. So that was this week's shape exploration. So exploring shapes through colour this week, and I think it gives the work a very different effect. So let me know what you think of these, and I'll see you next time for another shape exploration.